When we hear the word slavery, most of us picture something safely locked away in history. We imagine distant plantations, iron shackles, and faded photographs behind museum glass. But the uncomfortable truth is that modern slavery is not confined to distant factories or forgotten places. Sometimes it exists closer than we realize. Sometimes it's hidden behind the front door of an ordinary home, living quietly alongside everyday life, almost invisible to everyone outside. Long before the rest of the household awakes, another day has already begun. Breakfast is prepared, floors are cleaned, laundry is folded. The routine repeats itself day after day, often without anyone stopping to ask who's doing the work or under what circumstances. The same pattern appears far beyond our neighborhoods as the first light reaches fields around the world. Countless workers begin harvesting the food that will eventually reach every grocery store thousands of miles away. Most of us will never know their names. Far from shore, another world is already at work. Fishing vessels disappear over the horizon for weeks or even months at a time. What happens aboard them is rarely seen by the people who eventually buy the catch. Meanwhile, cities continue to climb skyward. Towers of concrete and steel reshape the skylines across the globe, each one built by thousands of hands whose stories are often forgotten long before the ribbon is cut. Inside factories, production rarely stops. Hour after hour, products move steadily down assembly lines, destined for stores, warehouses, and homes built around the world. We admire the finished product, but seldom pause to think about the journey that brought it there. And that's where the human story often disappears. The greater the distance between the person who makes a product and the person who buys it, the easier it becomes to forget that another human being stood somewhere at the beginning of that chain. Perhaps that's why so much exploitation survives unnoticed. It doesn't usually announce itself with dramatic headlines or obvious warning signs. More often, it hides inside ordinary routines, ordinary jobs, and ordinary days. So perhaps the challenge before us isn't to simply look. We've always been looking. The real challenge is learning to look again, to see familiar places with new eyes, to ask different questions, and to recognize the human stories that have been there all along, waiting to be noticed. By now, it's easy to see that none of these stories exist in isolation. They are all connected by something much larger, a global economy that links billions of people who will never meet. Everyday products, materials, and money move across oceans and continents with astonishing speed, connecting strangers through commerce in ways previous generations could scarcely imagine. Consider something as ordinary as a cotton shirt. Before it reaches a store shelf, it may travel through several countries, passing through farms, spinning mills, textile factories, cargo ships, warehouses, and distribution centers. By the time we pick it up, its journey has become almost impossible to trace. At every step along that journey, businesses face familiar pressures. They compete on cost, quality, and speed, each trying to deliver more while spending less. Most companies operate ethically, but intense competition can create incentives that ripple through an entire supply chain. That pressure doesn't simply disappear. It moves from one supplier to another, from manufacturer to subcontractor, from one contract to the next. Each decision may seem small on its own, yet together they shape the environment in which millions of people work every day. By the time those products finally reach us, we usually see only the finished result. We compare prices, examine quality, and make ordinary purchasing decisions. Very rarely do we see the thousands of choices and thousands of workers that made these products possible. Distance has a remarkable way of changing perspective. The farther removed we are from the beginning of a supply chain, the easier it becomes to assume that someone else has already asked the difficult questions on our behalf. And today's supply chains are extraordinarily complex. A single product can involve dozens of companies. Complexity isn't inherently wrong, but it can make accountability far more difficult. Sometimes exploitation survives not because people deliberately support it, but because no one can easily see the entire picture. Information becomes fragmented, responsibility becomes divided, and what falls between those gaps can remain hidden for years. Yet these systems are ultimately built from human decisions. Consumers make choices, businesses make choices, investors, regulators, employers, and governments make choices. None of us controls the entire system, but all of us participated in some way. That leads us to a deeper question, one that this documentary has been quietly building toward from the very beginning. The question is not whether global trade should exist. Global trade has lifted millions out of poverty and transform the modern world. The real question is whether prosperity can continue to grow without ever asking human dignity to pay part of the price. When we talk about modern slavery, we often begin with numbers. Researchers estimate millions of people are living under conditions of forced labor or coercion around the world. Those numbers help us understand the scale of the problem, but numbers have one important limitation. They can measure how many lives are affected, but they can never capture what a single human life is worth, or its dignity for that matter. Every one of those numbers was once simply a person, someone with a name, someone with a family, someone who laughed with friends, celebrated birthdays, made plans for the future, and imagined a life that looked very much like our own. For many, the journey began with hope. Not extraordinary hope, just ordinary hope. Hope that has motivated people throughout history, finding a better job, earning enough to support a family, or creating opportunities that simply didn't exist at home. Those hopes are neither unusual or naive. They're deeply human. And while someone leaves in search of opportunity, someone else stays behind. Parents wait for phone calls. Children count the days until a familiar face returns. Families measure time in birthdays missed, holidays postponed, and promises made with sincere beliefs that tomorrow will be a better day. For those caught in exploitation, life often becomes defined by not dramatic moments, but by repetition. The same alarm before dawn, the same long hours, the same exhausting routine, repeated so often that one day becomes almost impossible to distinguish from the next. Some stories never make headlines. Some conversations never happen. Some letters are never finished, and some phone calls are never made. Entire chapters of people's lives unfold quietly, unnoticed by everyone except those who continue waiting for them to come home. When freedom is taken away, something else often begins to disappear as well. Not just movement or opportunity, but identity of self. A person slowly stops being seen as an individual and instead becomes known only for the work they perform, the debt they owe, or the value someone else places on their labor. And yet, even in the most difficult circumstances, hope has a remarkable way of surviving. Throughout history, people have found ways to preserve their dignity through friendship, faith, family, humor, and the simple determination to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. Perhaps that's why it's important to remember that no one should ever be defined entirely by what's happened to them. They are not merely victims. They are mothers and fathers, daughters and sons, neighbors, co-workers, teachers, dreamers, and people whose lives contain far more than the worst chapter of their story. In the end, modern slavery will always be discussed in terms of millions, but understanding begins much closer than that. It begins with one face, one voice, one family, one story. Because every great injustice, no matter how widespread, is ultimately experienced one human being at a time. And once we begin to see people instead of numbers, it's impossible to look at the world in quite the same way again. History has a curious way of flattering us. Most of us believe that had we lived in another century, we would have recognized injustice immediately. We imagine ourselves standing with the abolitionists rather than the slave traders, with the reformers rather than those who resisted change. But every generation tends to believe that about itself. Perhaps that's one reason museums feel so comforting. We walk through their halls, looking at artifacts from another age, quietly grateful that those moral battles seem to belong to someone else. The past asks very little of us except remembrance. The present asks something far more difficult. It asks whether there are injustices that have become so ordinary, so woven into everyday life, that we no longer recognize them for what they are. Every generation eventually faces its own moral questions. The challenge is that they rarely announce themselves as history while they are happening. Most of those questions don't arrive in dramatic moments. They appear quietly in the products we buy, the stories we choose to read, the conversations we have, and sometimes in the questions we never think to ask. History is often shaped less by extraordinary events than by countless ordinary decisions. And perhaps attention is one of the most valuable things we possess. We become experts at noticing what matters to us while overlooking everything else. Yet what we notice gradually shapes what we value, and what we value eventually influences the kind of society that we build together. Of course, no one can know everything. The modern world is simply too large and too complex. But there is a difference between not knowing because something is difficult to discover and choosing not to know because the answer might make us uncomfortable. No single consumer created today's global economy, and no individual can transform it overnight. That would be asking too much of any one person. Yet history also reminds us that meaningful change rarely begins with everyone. More often, it begins when enough people decide that looking away is no longer acceptable. Responsibility, then, is rarely carried by one group alone. Governments establish laws, businesses make decisions, communities shape expectations, consumers create demand. Journalists investigate, teachers educate. Each contributes a small piece to a much larger picture, and each has a role to play in improving it. Which brings us back to the question that has quietly followed us throughout this journey. The question has never been whether exploitation exists. Human history leaves little doubt about that. The real question is whether we're willing to recognize it when it no longer resembles the version we've been taught to expect. And possibly, that is the true measure of a civilization. Not simply what it builds, invents, or accomplishes, but what it refuses to ignore. Long after skyscrapers, weather, and economies change, history remembers something deeper. It remembers how people treated one another, and whether when confronted with difficult truths, they found the courage to look honestly at themselves. If history teaches us anything, it's that progress is rarely the end of the story. The abolition of legal slavery was one of humanity's greatest moral achievements. It changed laws, transformed institutions, and affirmed a principle that should never be forgotten, that no human being should be treated as property. But ending one form of injustice did not guarantee that every future generation would recognize the next disguise. That is why the work continues. Around the world, investigators follow financial trails, journalists uncover hidden stories, researchers collect evidence, and advocates work quietly behind the scenes. Most of their names will never be widely known, but history has often been shaped by people willing to be asking difficult questions after others had stopped looking. The law continues to evolve as well. Nations strengthen legislation, courts hear new cases, and international agreements attempt to address crimes that often cross borders. Laws matter because they establish standards, but as history reminds us, laws alone cannot eliminate practices that survive through secrecy, corruption, or indifference. Many businesses are also asking difficult questions about their own supply chains. Audits, transparency programs, worker protections, and independent inspections have become increasingly important tools for reducing exploitation. Progress is often imperfect, but genuine improvements begin when problems are acknowledged rather than ignored. Education plays its own role. Every student who learns this history, every teacher who refuses to oversimplify it, and every conversation that replaces assumption with understanding helps build a society that is better equipped to recognize exploitation when it appears in new forms. And maybe that is what each generation inherits, not only the accomplishments of those who came before, but also the responsibility to look at the world with fresh eyes. Every age believes it understands justice, yet every age eventually discovers that there were things it failed to see. History is rarely changed by a single dramatic moment. More often, it changes through thousands of ordinary decisions made by ordinary people. Someone chose to investigate instead of looking away. Someone asks another question. Someone refuses to accept that exploitation is simply the cost of doing business. Small decisions repeated over time become movements. Real progress almost never arrives at once. It advances in uneven steps, sometimes quickly, sometimes painfully slow. These are setbacks, disappointments, and moments when old problems return in new forms. But measured over generations rather than headlines, humanity has repeatedly shown that change is possible when people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. And that means the next chapter has not been written. The systems we inherit are not fixed forever. They will be shaped by choices we make, the questions we continue to ask, and the standards we decide are worth defending. History remains unfinished because every generation adds another page. Possibly, that is the most encouraging lesson of all. The struggle against slavery has never belonged to one nation, one movement, or one century. It belongs to every generation that refuses to accept that another human being can be reduced to a commodity. The forms may change, the methods may evolve, but so does the determination of people who continue to work. And because of them, the story of humanity has never been only a story of oppression. It has also been a story of conscience, courage, and a persistent belief that tomorrow can be better than today. We began this journey inside a museum, surrounded by artifacts from a world we like to believe no longer exists. It is comforting to think that history can be neatly placed behind glass, carefully labeled, and left for future generations to simply observe. But history has never stayed inside museums. It continues to shape the present, not because the past repeats itself exactly, but because human nature continues to wrestle with many of the same temptations, the same ambitions, and the same moral choices. The people we've considered throughout this documentary may live in different countries, speak different languages, and come from different cultures, yet they share something more fundamental than all those differences. They are human beings whose dignity should never depend upon where they were born or how much power they possess. And so we return to the question that has quietly guided us through this entire journey. What is a human being worth? Not economically, not politically, not strategically, but morally. Every civilization eventually answers that question, not simply through speeches or constitutions, but through the everyday choices it makes. Those choices belong to all of us. They appear in the questions we ask, the institutions we build, the standards we expect, and the willingness to keep looking even after the headlines have faded. No single decision changes the world overnight, but history is often redirected by countless ordinary people choosing not to remain indifferent. That is why this story remains unfinished. Every generation inherits both remarkable achievements and unfinished responsibilities. Progress is never permanent. Justice is never self-sustaining. Each must be renewed by people willing to carry them forward. And perhaps that's the lesson that history offers more than any other. Human beings have repeatedly shown an extraordinary capacity for cruelty, but they have also demonstrated an equally extraordinary capacity for compassion, courage, and moral growth. The future has never been determined by failures alone. It has always been shaped by those willing to confront them. If this documentary has done anything, I hope it has encouraged you to not merely learn another piece of history, but to look at the present with a little more curiosity and a little more humility. The questions raised here are larger than any single film can answer. This documentary began as the opening chapters of a much larger exploration. The stories, the histories, the economics, and the people behind them continue far beyond what we've been able to cover here. If you'd like to continue the journey, you'll find it in The World's Oldest Injustice is Still Thriving.